At the intertestamental period, what nations emerged during that time?
Absolutely. Let's dive into that. So, during the intertestamental period, roughly that gap of a few centuries between the Old and New Testaments, there were some really significant shifts in which powers were dominant. At the start of this period, you'd have the Persian Empire still in control, but then along comes Alexander the Great and the rise of the Hellenistic kingdoms. So you get these Greek influenced successor states, like the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, that really shaped the region. And later on, of course, Rome starts to come into the picture, gradually extending its influence and eventually taking over Judea before the New Testament era kicks off. So it's a time of pretty dynamic geopolitical changes.
So it's the those nations was mentioned in the book of Daniel.
Exactly, you've got it. The book of Daniel actually has these pretty fascinating symbolic visions that many interpret as referring to the rise and fall of these empires. For example, those beasts and statues that you see in Daniel's visions are often understood to represent exactly these major powers, like the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greeks under Alexander, and then the Romans. So yep, a lot of those nations from the intertestamental period are kind of foreshadowed symbolically in Daniel.
So, what impact did these nations did to the Israelites?
Yeah, it's a great question because each of these empires definitely left their mark on the Israelites in pretty unique ways. So, for instance, under the Persians, the Israelites actually got a good deal of religious freedom. They were even allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Then, when you get to the Greeks, especially under the Seleucids, there was a lot of Hellenistic cultural influence. That meant the spread of Greek language, customs, and because some Israelites embraced that Greek culture while others resisted it strongly, and that resistance is what eventually led to things like the Maccabean Revolt. And finally, when the Romans came onto the scene, they brought a whole new level of political control and infrastructure, but also taxation and a lot of political tension, which kind of sets the stage for the New Testament era. So each of these empires left a pretty distinct footprint on the Israelites' history and culture.
So most the influence the country was Greek.
Yeah, you're definitely on the right track. The Greek or Hellenistic influence was huge. It really shapes the culture of that entire region, including the Israelites. Things like the widespread use of the Greek language, so that's why a lot of the New Testament is written in Greek, and just the general spread of Greek philosophy and ideas really left a deep impact. So, yeah, the Greek influence was definitely one of the most prominent during that time.
So what exactly the Hellenism? What is Hellenism?
Absolutely, let's break that down. So, Hellenism basically refers to the spread of Greek culture, language, and ideas across the regions that were conquered by Alexander the Great. After his conquests, Greek culture kind of mingled with local cultures, and this blending is what we call Hellenism. So it wasn't just about speaking Greek, it was about adopting Greek ways of thinking, Greek styles of art, philosophy, governance, and even things like gymnasiums and theaters. It was kind of this whole cultural package that spread widely and influenced a lot of the ancient world during that period.
So when what? Tell me exact time period of that intertestamental the period.
Sure. So the intertestamental period is generally considered to be roughly from the end of the Old Testament writings to the beginning of the New Testament events. It's typically placed around the 400s BCE after the prophet Malachi, and it runs up to the early 1st century CE, just before the birth of Jesus and the events of the Gospels. So you're looking at a span of about 400 years, give or take, where there's a lot of historical change, but not biblical texts being written.
So the Hellenism was popular from that period of time, or it lasts longer?
Yeah, so Hellenism Hellenism really took root and stayed influential for quite a long time. It kicked off with Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BCE, and even after his empire split up, the Greek cultural influence just kept going for centuries. In fact, it was still very much alive well into the Roman period. The Romans themselves adopted a lot of Greek culture, so in a way, Hellenism stayed popular for several hundred years, blending into the broader Greco-Roman world all the way into the early centuries of the Common Era.
So who are the big names for the Hellenism philosophers?
Absolutely. There's a whole roster of big names when it comes to Hellenistic philosophers. For starters, you've got folks like Zeno of Citium, who founded Stoicism, and Epicurus, who founded Epicureanism. Both of those schools of thought really flourished during the Hellenistic period. And then, of course, you have the legacy of earlier philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, whose works were still hugely influential and studied widely in this era. So those are some of the big names you'll hear when people talk about Hellenistic philosophy. They really shaped a lot of the intellectual landscape of the time.
So at the time, did Israelites influenced by the Hellenism culture?
Absolutely, they were. The Israelites definitely felt the impact of Hellenistic culture during that period. You had Greek language becoming really common, so a lot of Jews were speaking Greek and even reading their scriptures in Greek translation, like the Septuagint. And beyond language, there were definitely influences in things like philosophy and daily life. Of course, there were groups among the Israelites who resisted that influence and wanted to hold on to their traditional ways. But overall, Hellenistic culture definitely made its mark on the Jewish people during that time.
So because of the Maccabean revolt, the Pharisee won a strong Messiah who can rule the whole world.
Yeah, you've got the gist of it. The Maccabean Revolt was this big moment where Jewish rebels fought back against the Hellenistic influence and the Seleucid rulers. And after that, a lot of groups, including the Pharisees, were definitely hoping for a strong Messiah figure. They were looking for someone who could lead them, not just spiritually, but also politically, someone who could essentially free them from foreign rule and restore kingdom. So that hope for a Messiah who could rule and bring liberation definitely became a big part of the mindset after events like the Maccabean Revolt.